You will not defy me!
You dare defy me!
I will not be silenced by your tyranny!
How dare you defy me! I will not be silenced by your tyranny!
Hey guys, tonight we'll peel back the curtain on a chapter of history that has never been told. A story even darker than any horror movie you've ever watched. Can you believe that the Henry VIII, you know, the fat king who loved turkey legs and had 6 wives, is just a sanitized version of history? Because the truth about him is so terrifying that it would make modern serial killers jealous. Get ready for some shocks as we explore 5 absolutely insane secrets about Henry's bedroom. Truths that have been buried in the darkness for centuries. This isn't just the story of a king. It's an explanation for his deranged actions. Trust me, once you learn this, you'll never look at history the same way again. And number 5 is so disturbing that I had to verify it 3 times before including it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Secret 1. Rotting King's Physical Horror. By the year 1536, the once formidable figure of King Henry VIII had begun to betray the ravages of time and disease. Though he had been celebrated for his broad shoulders, powerful posture, and the fine silks that draped his frame, the truth hidden behind the velvet curtains of his chambers was far more dreadful. Underneath the regal doublet and opulent robes lay festering wounds, massive ulcers in his legs, that historians now believe were symptoms of osteomyelitis, a bone infection so severe it ate away at flesh and marrow alike. These sores never healed. They wept pus through torn leather bandages, exuding a rancid stench that would choke the strongest stomachs. Each evening before the king retired, an anxious company of servants performed a grisly routine. First, they would lance and drain the oozing sores, coaxing the hot yellow fluid from deep within his leg. Then, they coated the open wounds with perfumed oils in a futile attempt to mask the odor that clung to Henry's flesh like a curse. Finally, they bound his legs tightly in plaster-laced bandages and metal splints, rigid braces that held his shattered bones in a macabre embrace. This ritual, carried out by trembling hands, was meant to preserve some appearance of health, yet in doing so it merely prolonged his suffering. From dusk until dawn, the king's pain was unrelenting. The agony gnawed at his nerves ceaselessly, day in and day out, while the weight of his own body pressed down on his infected limbs. Those who attended him spoke in hushed tones of his transformations. Once a commanding presence, he had become prone to sudden fits of rage and despair. What courtiers dismissed as royal temper was, in truth, the anguished roar of a man whose flesh betrayed him. Chronic insomnia, the byproduct of relentless torment, left him haunted by nightmares and driven to bursts of unpredictable violence. Some nights, his cries of pain echoed through the palace corridors like the wails of a wounded beast. Worse yet was the nighttime soundtrack of his skeletal anguish. Anne Boleyn, his second queen, confided in secret letters that she could hear the sinister creaking and cracking of Henry's bones as he shifted beneath the covers. "It is as if the very marrow within him fractures," she wrote, "and each movement sounds like a grim melody of doom." Such revelations, penned in the quiet hours, paint a portrait of intimacy turned to horror. The conjugal bed, meant to be a retreat of closeness, became instead a venue for psychological torture. Each rattling groan a reminder of the king's mortal decay. Even the renowned skill of the Tudor medical practitioners proved no remedy. Their remedies, harsh substances and primitive narcotics, offered fleeting respite at best. Laudanum and other opiates, administered in crude doses, would sometimes dull the pain, but left Henry disoriented and feverish. These so-called cures robbed him of lucidity, plunging him deeper into depression and fueling rumors of madness within the royal circle. As his body rotted, so too did his spirit crumble under the burden of endless suffering. Beyond the personal torment, Henry's condition cast a pall over the entire court. The air within Hampton Court Palace grew thick with the odour of poisoned perfume, burned incessantly in braziers to veil the smell of death. Servants volunteered for the duty of dousing the corridors with lavender oil, only to faint or flee in terror. Diplomats arriving from foreign courts whispered anxiously among themselves, uncertain whether to bow in deference or recoil in horror. The facade of regal splendour belied a palace steeped in decay. Under such grim circumstances, the Queen was pressured to feign normalcy. Royal protocol demanded that Anne Boleyn present a united front, greeting her husband with courtesy and displaying none of the repulsion she must have felt. Behind closed doors, however, she was forced into an uneasy performance. To lie beside a man whose rotten flesh threatened to engulf her own body, her very dignity eroded by the need to conceal her revulsion. Each night, she endured the proximity of pus-soaked bandages and metal braces, a silent witness to the king's physical collapse. In summoning this secret to light, we confront a side of Tudor history seldom acknowledged. The rot in Henry's flesh was mirrored by the moral decay concealed beneath courtly ceremony. The king's ulcerated legs became a symbol of a power that, though outwardly invincible, was ravaged from within. This first secret, Secret 1, rotting king's physical horror, lays bare the foundation of his cruelty and instability. It is the grotesque prelude to the darker chapters that would follow, where physical deterioration intertwines with psychological terror. In the hushed stillness of the night, behind walls of stone and tapestries of silk, the seeds of tyranny and suffering took root sown in the bedchambers of a king whose body betrayed him long before his reign would crumble. Secret 2. Theatre of humiliation and control. If Secret 1 laid bare the physical torment that befell King Henry VIII, Secret 2 reveals the chilling spectacle of psychological torture he devised for his queens. In the twilight hush of the royal court, Henry fashioned a stage upon which human dignity was laid waste, transforming solemn legal proceedings into grotesque performances of power. Rather than quietly dispatching a wife he deemed unfit, he orchestrated a public theatre of degradation that seared itself into the minds of every spectator most cruelly, into the hearts of the victims themselves. The centrepiece of this macabre drama was the sham trial of Anne Boleyn. On a cold morning in the year 1536, Anne was escorted into Westminster Hall, not as a princess or beloved queen, but as a criminal destined for ignominy. Henry, ever the grand director, ensured that every detail served his purpose. Court officials read out fabricated charges of adultery and incest, claiming that Anne had betrayed the king with her own brother. Anne's brother, already ensnared by Henry's machinations, stood accused of an unspeakable crime and was led to execution before the gathered crowd. The clang of the executioner's axe, the sickening thud as the blade met flesh, and the fountain of crimson blood all formed the prologue to Anne's own undoing. Forced to witness her brother's beheading, she was left to confront the realization that her family had been sacrificed to feed the king's rage and salvage his wounded pride. But Henry's cruelty extended even further. He did not content himself with Anne's despair. He compelled their young daughter Elizabeth, aged 11, to attend the trial. Imagine an 11-year-old child, her innocence shattered by the sight of her mother, branded a witch before the very court that once showered her with floral welcome. As Anne stood quietly beside her accusers, Elizabeth was stationed in the gallery, her small hand clenched in terror, while courtiers whispered and pointed. The hall, normally filled with deference and awe, reverberated with laughter at Anne's expense. This laughter was not mere amusement. It was the laughter of a monarch intoxicated by absolute power, of a man who found delight in his victim's downfall. According to the chronicler Cordiers, Henry sat on his raised dais and laughed uproariously at each moment of Anne's degradation, as though savouring each rupture of her dignity. When Catherine Howard became queen, barely 19 years old, she too was thrust into this relentless theatre of humiliation. Young and impressionable, Catherine arrived at Hampton Court, bright-eyed and hopeful, only to discover that the king's affections were as treacherous as they were fervent. Within weeks of her coronation, rumours began to swirl, planted by Henry's advisers, suggesting that Catherine had been less than faithful. Summoned to court under the guise of a private audience, she found herself enmeshed in the same cruel machinery that had claimed Anne. The night before her trial, servants along the palace corridors reported hearing Catherine's sobs echo through the grand halls, a haunting prelude to her public disgrace. Over the course of 3 harrowing days, Catherine endured a forced recital of her alleged crimes. Each morning she was brought before a tribunal of judges who repeated the same false accusations: infidelity, betrayal, conspiracy. Following the reading of each charge, Catherine was compelled to stand in silence while lawyers and nobles extolled the king's righteous anger and the necessity of punishment. They declared her an enemy of the crown, a corrupter of royal blood. In this prolonged ritual, Catherine watched as her reputation was eroded brick by brick, until nothing remained but the facade of a traitor. Only after enduring this ordeal, after 3 sunrises filled with relentless condemnation, was she allowed to return to her chambers. Yet the return offered no comfort. Her bedchamber, once a sanctuary, had been indelibly stained by the shame that clung to her clothing and hair. This engineered spectacle served purposes far beyond vengeance. It sent a message, reverberating through every corner of the realm. Defiance of the king would not be met with quiet retribution, but with public annihilation of the self. The methodical dismantling of a queen's honour served to warn all who watched that the monarch's wrath spared no one. The procession of trial, execution, and public denouncement became the ultimate demonstration of absolute authority. Theatrical as it was, this theatre of humiliation drew on medieval pageantry and Tudor legalism to craft a new form of terrorism by spectacle. Long after the executions and remonstrations, the echo of those judicial drums lingered. The courtiers who had laughed and jeered carried with them the memory of watching a crowned head humbled before their eyes. The populace, accustomed to the grandeur of pageants and tournaments, found themselves horrified by the king's capacity for orchestrated cruelty. And the queens who survived, if they did, lived under the shadow of those staged atrocities, their trust in both God and sovereign forever fractured. In the quiet chamber behind the throne, Henry watched his creations unfold with the cool detachment of a playwright savouring a well-turned scene. He was both audience and director, orchestrating each gesture, each gasp, and each hushed whisper until the final curtain fell. The marriages that began in splendour ended in tragedy, not solely through the blade, but through the more insidious wounds inflicted upon the soul. By the time Catherine Howard was led away, the name of Queen resonated less as a title of honour and more as a harbinger of humiliation. Thus unfolds Secret 2, Theatre of Humiliation and Control, a chapter in which Henry VIII mastered the darkest arts of psychological warfare. Behind the velvet drapes and chased gold of the Tudor court, he erected a stage that eroded the very core of human identity. For the queens who dared to share his bed, the promise of royal favour turned swiftly into a nightmare of public shaming, an ordeal that transcended any ordinary trial, leaving scars deeper than any sword could carve. In that silent dawn after the final pronouncement, as the mace-bearers of justice withdrew and the court dispersed, the lingering hush spoke of a terror far more enduring than death itself. Secret 3. Bizarre Rituals and Bedroom Madness. In the hushed gloom behind the heavy silk drapes of the royal bedchamber lies Secret 3, Bizarre Rituals and Bedroom Madness, a succession of nightly horrors that transformed what should have been a private refuge into a chamber of ritualized torment. As dusk settled over Hampton Court Palace, the king's attendants braced themselves for the elaborate, gruesome routine known throughout the household as the pre-sleep maintenance. Each night, a hand-picked contingent of servants assembled in tense silence, aware that their task was not merely cleansing but an act of macabre devotion to a sovereign whose body was at war with itself. First came the draining of festering wounds. Henry VIII's leg ulcers, ravaged by years of untreated infection, wept a thick yellow pus that clung stubbornly to bandages. With trembling hands, the attendants applied heated lancets to cut open the sores, coaxing the poison from deep within the flesh. The air filled with the stench of rot, an odour so potent it sent loyal courtiers reeling toward fresh air windows. Yet, these perforations offered only fleeting relief, for the underlying infection persisted, gnawing at bone and marrow like a ravenous beast. Following the drainage, the servants reached for flasks of exotic oils and perfumes imported at great expense. These scented potions rose attar, clove oil, jasmine essence were intended to mask the relentless odour of decay. Lavish quantities were poured over the wounds and into folded linen, creating a harsh contrast between the king's sweet-smelling anointing and the rotting flesh beneath. This ritual, part necessity and part grotesque pageant, became a nightly testament to the king's desperation. No amount of perfume could disguise the truth of his bodily collapse. Once the perfumed salves were in place, the next step was the wrapping. Servants bound Henry's legs in stiff bandages, then enclosed them in metal splints and wooden braces fashioned to immobilize his shattered bones. The sight of his legs, encased in cruel scaffolding, made the entire bedchamber resemble a forge of suffering. Each strap, each iron hinge, served to hold together a body that was literally falling apart. A moving testament to the king's physical and psychological imprisonment. But the king's paranoia extended beyond the confines of his own ailments. Henry became convinced that his queens, those once celebrated partners upon whom he had lavished riches, were plotting his demise through the most intimate of betrayals. He feared they would smear his skin with poison or deliver him fatal toxins in clandestine kisses. Thus was born the purity test, a ritual as humiliating as it was absurd. Before any queen might approach him in the bedchamber, she was required to undergo a private examination. She would dip a finger into coarse sea salt and lick it clean under the watchful eyes of Henry's most trusted bodyguards. One misstep, a moment's hesitation, or even a flinch could be construed as confirmation of murderous intent. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, famously endured this indignity, her lips pressed tremblingly to salt crystals as the king peered on, searching for any sign of deception. Another test involved garments and linens. The queen's chemise and petticoats were dunked in water and then treated with a selection of potent herbs and roots believed to detect poison. These soaked fabrics were placed in sealed boxes for days, then examined by court physicians who claimed that any discoloration or peculiar odor signaled a deadly substance. Only when the garments emerged clean was the queen permitted to share the royal bed. These rituals, a bizarre blend of superstition and cruelty, transformed every night into a gauntlet of indignities, meant to reassure the king of his wives' loyalty, even as they eroded their own dignity. Yet the madness did not end with these flesh and garment ordeals. Henry, in his growing hysteria, enlisted the clerical arts to sanctify his suffering, or so he believed. Small altars were erected at the foot of his bed, upon which stood crucifixes and relics of saints. Flasks of holy water were kept at hand for nightly blessings, while silk sheets purportedly blessed by the archbishop clung to the mattress. Henry spent vast sums commissioning blessed oils, paying priests to anoint his bedposts and linens in elaborate rituals he hoped would ward off the curse he believed was laid upon him by divine judgment. In the dim glow of candlelight, these actions lent his pajamas a chapel-like atmosphere, as though he sought to merge his infirmity and his faith into a single act of devotional atonement. For Henry VIII, the bedchamber became a crucible of bodily disintegration and spiritual desperation. The nightly performance of draining, anointing, testing, and blessing was less a medical procedure than a ceremony of self-flagellation. The once glorious apartments, draped in crimson velvet and lined with gilded tapestries, echoed with the hollow footsteps of servants carrying out their grim duties. Any echo of laughter or conversation gave way to solemnity and dread. The bedchamber was no longer a place of rest, but a hallowed ground where fear and superstition reigned. Through these bizarre rituals, Henry sought to control the one domain that had become irretrievably unruly, his own unhealthy body. Yet each ceremony reinforced his fragility, magnifying his paranoia and fueling the cruelty he would later unleash upon those closest to him. Even the queens, bound by oath and protocol, found themselves ensnared in these nightly torments, their bodies and spirits tested not by love, but by a king's prism of terror. Thus, Secret 3. Bizarre rituals and bedroom madness stands as a testament to the extremes of royal absolutism. In the stillness of each night, as candle flames flickered against tapestried walls, the pattern of madness repeated itself. The king's disease laid bare, then masked with perfume. His suspicions materialized in salt and herbs. His faith invoked to salve a soul torn by agony. These rituals did not heal Henry VIII. They bound him more tightly to the spectre of his own rotting flesh and the chasm of his unraveling mind. In that strange, sorrowful twilight, the Tudor bedchamber became a theatre not of intimacy, but of ritualized terror, an endless prelude to the darker secrets that lay ahead. Secret 4. Mighty King's ultimate humiliation. At the pinnacle of his power, Henry VIII fancied himself the undisputed Lord of Europe, a monarch whose will bent nations and churches to his design. He had redrawn maps, severed ties with the papacy, and imposed his decrees across the realm. Yet, As the sun dipped below the horizon and the hush of night enveloped his grand chambers, the fiercest trial of his reign awaited him, one he would fail time and again. For in the shadowed intimacy of his bedchamber lay the undisclosed truth that the most formidable king of his age had become utterly impotent. By the time he reached the age of 40, the ravages of his own body had stripped Henry of the one function he prized above all, the ability to father a male heir. His once robust frame had swollen under excess, his legs ravaged by unhealing ulcers. Nightly those wounds tortured him. Daily his physicians provided only crude remedies that dulled neither the pain nor the despair. The king's manhood, the very symbol of his masculine dominion, had withered under the weight of chronic infection and unrelenting distress. Each failed attempt at intimacy delivered a blow to his ego so profound that he could scarcely bear the whisper of his wife's name. These failures did not pass in quiet sorrow. Instead, they ignited volcanic tempers within the royal bedchamber. Henry, a man long accustomed to command, could not tolerate impotence even in private. Each night that his duties of husband and nation remained unfulfilled, he erupted in fury that rattled tapestries and shattered silence. Servants and ladies in waiting trembled behind closed doors as they heard the king's heavy footsteps approach. Then the thunderous crash of furniture hurled in blind rage. Reporters of the court, ever dutiful in recording history's intricate details, noted that Catherine Howard, his fifth queen, would shrink back at the sounds of his wrath, her small form curled in the alcove, while Henry's laments echoed down the corridors. It was not merely emotional outbursts that marked these dark hours, but a systematic unleashing of violence against any soul unfortunate enough to stand in his way. A glance deemed insufficiently respectful could draw his savage ire. Eyes that dared betray pity or, worse, contempt onlookers might find themselves swept into the maelstrom of his anger. Palace records hint at gentlemen-at-arms dragged from their chambers and threatened with execution for the slightest perceived impropriety. In these moments, the hallways of Whitehall became a gauntlet of terror, where the Crown's authority manifested as unrestrained brutality. But a king of Henry's intellect understood that spontaneous rage alone could not conceal the searing humiliation of his impotence. He required legal justification, a veneer of legitimacy for his vengeful impulses. Thus, he summoned lawyers and bishops to craft charges against Catherine Howard, accusing her of adultery, a convenient contrivance that cast her inability to conceive sons as a sign of her moral corruption. The court was instructed to record her so-called transgressions in meticulous detail: stolen glances, clandestine encounters, whispered conversations. These allegations were then used to strip Catherine of her queenship, ensuring that her final moments in the royal presence were marked not by compassion, but by the cold mechanics of state-sanctioned betrayal. From a medical perspective, Henry's violent reactions were less demonstrations of royal prerogative and more symptoms of acute psychological distress. Modern historians and physicians speculate that the pain of his affliction combined with sexual dysfunction produced a potent mix of humiliation and paranoia. Each unsuccessful night became evidence in his mind that Catherine did not deserve the privileges of a queen. And so he weaponized the law to punish not the disease, but the spouse, a twisted inversion of justice driven by wounded pride and bodily shame. Yet even the theatrical spectacle of Catherine's downfall failed to quell the gnawing void within Henry. In his desperation to reclaim any semblance of virility, he turned to the ultimate expression of his sovereign will, the executioner's block. From the year 1540 onward, the axe fell with renewed frequency. Each condemned prisoner, whether noble or commoner, served as a grim offering to an unforgiving heaven. Rumours circulated that Henry viewed every execution as a sacrificial rite, beseeching God to restore his faltering potency. Rather than find solace in the litany of deaths he ordered, the king found himself trapped in a cycle of violence that only deepened his despair. Indeed, the more lives he extinguished, the more his humiliation festered. The public spectacles, intended to exhibit his control, instead revealed the depth of his insecurity. Onlookers whispered that the cries of the condemned mingled with a melancholic lament rising from the tower's shadows, a lament not for the lost souls below, but for a king who had sacrificed his humanity on the altar of sexual inadequacy. In the hush of the night, after the roar of the axe had faded and the drip of blood beneath the scaffold had ceased, Henry would retire to his chamber alone. There, The echoes of his own authority slipped into silence. The chain of command, so mighty by day, was powerless to rouse within him the strength he so desperately craved. The bed, once believed to be the domain of sovereign potency, lay cold and unwelcoming. Thus stands Secret 4, Mighty King's Ultimate Humiliation, a chronicle of a monarch defeated by his own body. At daybreak he reclaimed the mantle of majesty, adorned himself in ermine and silk, and resumed the business of state as though oblivious to the nights of fury and shame. But behind the gilded doors, Henry VIII lived each evening with the bitter knowledge that absolute power could not defeat a king's own failing flesh. In that perpetual twilight, the mightiest sovereign in Europe lay humiliated, his roar reduced to an echo in an empty chamber, an echo that would outlast his reign and haunt the annals of history. Secret 5. Legacy of a Monster's Bedroom Failures. As the final curtain falls on the tragic saga of Henry VIII's private chambers, we arrive at Secret 5. Legacy of a Monster's Bedroom Failures, where personal humiliation gave birth to seismic shifts that rippled across centuries. The king's inability to produce a male heir, a fact hidden behind perfumed bandages and whispered excuses, became the catalyst for a revolution in faith, a cascade of wars, and an enduring template for tyranny. When Henry VIII resolved to divorce Anne Boleyn, it was not a passionate quest for love, nor a noble pursuit of principle. Instead, it was a desperate maneuver to conceal his impotency. Unable to claim the throne's sanctified duty of fathering a son, he tore England from the spiritual embrace of Rome. In the year 1533, the Act of Supremacy declared the monarch as head of the Church of England, a title forged not in divine calling but in the crucible of personal shame. From that moment, religion ceased to be solely a matter of private conscience, and became an instrument of statecraft and subjugation. The Reformation that followed was hardly the calm, orderly affair later romanticized by some historians. Across the English countryside, abbeys were dismantled, monks and nuns were dispersed, and ancient liturgies were outlawed. The dissolution of the monasteries, undertaken with ruthless efficiency, saw the confiscation of vast church estates, which flooded into the hands of nobles eager to curry royal favour. Yet this seismic redistribution of wealth did not merely enrich the aristocracy. It entrenched a pattern of political repression, silencing any who dared mourn the lost sanctuaries of their forebears. In truth, the war of faith that swept across Europe, the anguished clashes between Catholic and Protestant factions, found one of its earliest and most decisive triggers in a king's private defeat. Across the English Channel and beyond, confessions of faith and doctrines became casualties of war. Provinces that once pledged resounding allegiance to the Pope now held services under a crown-appointed archbishop. Priests who resisted were branded traitors, their refusal deemed not only heresy but high treason. The fingerprints of Henry's loneliness are present in every decree that branded dissenters as enemies of the crown, every scaffold that ended in a perfunctory drop of the trapdoor. Yet the legacy did not halt at England's smoky skies. Later, despots looked to Henry's example as a blueprint for consolidating control. In the early 20th century, Joseph Stalin orchestrated show trials in Moscow's grand theatres, forcing false confessions from loyal party members. Mirroring the framework of theatrical humiliation, Henry deployed in his own court. Adolf Hitler, too, perfected the art of public denunciations, using mass rallies to shame and demonize every group deemed unwanted, not unlike the Tudor king's orchestration of his queen's disgrace. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, complete with denunciations, struggle sessions, and the dismantling of centuries-old cultural institutions, echoed the fervour with which Henry had razed the monasteries and prosecuted traitors to his bed. Underneath these regimes lay a common thread, the unwillingness of the powerful to admit personal failure. Instead of acknowledging their own limitations, whether medical, strategic or moral, they projected them onto scapegoats, unleashing waves of terror that claimed millions of lives. Henry's personal nightmare of impotency thus transformed into a systemic nightmare, where entire populations were held captive by the illusions of one man's wounded pride. Closer to home, the pattern infiltrated private lives as well. Families haunted by misuse of authority, spouses silenced by threats, children traumatized by parental wrath. Each thread can trace its origin to the toxic masculinity embodied by Henry VIII. A husband who beats to cover his fears, a partner who uses isolation to mask insecurity, an elder who punishes trust to hide vulnerability. These are the shadows cast by a king who who equated potency with power and frustration with fury. The modern world may have advanced in science, law, and human rights, yet the spectre of Henry's errors looms in boardrooms, living rooms, and political chambers. When leaders refuse accountability, they resurrect the same cycle: deny fault, enforce obedience, and punish perceived disloyalty. In countless corporate scandals and political purges, we witness the same architecture of control: a personal humiliation amplified into a public spectacle. Even within the nurturing confines of marriage, the echoes persist. Partners who leverage fear and shame to maintain dominance, believing that love must be entwined with authority, perpetuate the ancient template written in Henry's bedchamber. To break the cycle, societies must recognize the poison in this legacy, disentangling strength from dominance and reclaiming dignity from the ashes of humiliation. After 5 centuries, the tale of a king's decaying flesh and defiled intimacy remains no mere footnote in dusty archives. It stands as a stark warning. Secret 5. Legacy of a monster's bedroom. Failures urges us to see how one man's private torment spawned global upheavals and personal tragedies across generations. The bedchamber's satin sheets may have concealed his disease, but they could not contain the fallout. A reformation steeped in spilt blood, an era of tyrants wielding terror as a tool, and a cultural inheritance of fear, masquerading as authority. In closing, as our eyelids grow heavy with the weight of centuries, let us not drift into slumber without heeding this final lesson. Unchecked power, born of private shame, sows torment far beyond any single realm. To honor the memories of those lost to the king's need for control, whether in courtyard scaffoldings or behind closed bedroom doors, we must shine light on these dark truths and forge a future where failure does not justify cruelty and where the sanctity of human dignity remains inviolable. The most profound lesson drawn from Henry VIII's bedroom failures is how a personal humiliation can ignite monumental historical upheavals. When Henry resolved to sever all ties with the Roman Church in order to bring Anne Boleyn officially into his court, the driving force behind his decision was neither love nor idealistic reform, but rather a desperate desire to conceal his own impotence. In the year 1533, the Act of Supremacy declared the king as the supreme head of the Church of England, completely severing the authority of the Pope. On the surface, this move was hailed as a religious reformation, yet to Henry it represented a spectacular escape hatch, sparing him the shame he could not otherwise admit. From that moment onward, the legacy of his royal bedchamber began to spread, triggering a chain of dire consequences. Monasteries that had long served as centers of learning and charity were stripped of their assets. Religious orders were disbanded and their lands parceled out to nobles loyal to the crown. Rural communities, once anchored in traditional rites and guided by Roman clergy, found themselves spiritually orphaned. Under the edict of the Act of Uniformity, new liturgies were imposed and all former forms of worship were outlawed, transforming the English countryside into a hotbed of religious conflict. The gentle pilgrimage that once marked devotion became an angry march, culminating in the Pilgrimage of Grace in the year 1536. Thousands of innocent commoners were executed merely for clinging to their ancestral faith, turning the north of England into a bloody battleground of suppressed resentment. This inheritance did not stop at restructuring the church. It laid the groundwork for a centralized model of power that many later autocratic regimes would emulate. By using legislation to legitimize his divorce and compel the church to obey the sovereign's will, Henry set a precedent. Any policy, whether matrimonial or doctrinal, could be altered at will, without the consent of any external authority. Over time, the Church of England became an instrument of social and economic control, enabling the Crown to distribute confiscated lands to favoured courtiers. Fields that once yielded golden harvests were repurposed to serve royal prestige, bolstering the dynasty's authority for centuries. Concurrently, the flames of religious war spread across Europe. A tragic conflict between Catholics and Protestants erupted, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, razing cities, and tearing families apart. Many historians assert that the root cause of these wars lies in the Reformation born of Henry's physiological shame. When personal power is placed above spiritual freedom, tragedy becomes inevitable. That is why, even today, while the Church of England is often celebrated as a symbol of religious liberty, many philosophers and historians still refer to it as the church born of reproductive impotence, an indispensable piece of the political history puzzle. Viewed more broadly, this legacy reminds us that when power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual, even reforms or restructurings carry hidden dangers. Utilizing the law to conceal personal weaknesses, and then coercing society into a predetermined path, paves the way for violence and oppression. People lose control over their own faith, and dissident forces find opportunity in the ensuing discontent, erupting into bloody rebellions. Thus, Henry VIII's name is linked not only to splendid pageantry, but also to a bitter lesson in how one person's fear can redefine religion, reshape society, and sow centuries of resentment. The suffering born in that royal bedchamber became the seed for future generations of rulers, a warning that power cannot endure without mutual consent and checks on authority. And as Henry's historical visage fades into the mists of time, the legacy of his bedchamber still resonates like an alarm bell. Personal power, left unchecked, will turn private tragedy into public catastrophe, driving humanity into senseless conflict. In the silent hours before sleep, let Henry's lesson remind us that every great reform must be paired with respect for human dignity and transparency, or else history will repeat its darkest chapters. The legacy of Henry VIII did not end with 16th century England. The system of destruction and deceit that he pioneered became the prototype for many later dictatorships. For example, in the 1930s, Stalin staged show trials on fabricated charges of counter-revolution in order to purge party members. In Germany, Hitler used the Nuremberg laws to reshape legislation so as to legalize the persecution of the Jewish population. Mao Zedong in China launched the Cultural Revolution to eliminate intellectuals and long-standing cadres. What these regimes shared was a pattern. Policy failures or internal crises were always blamed on internal enemies, who were then publicly purged to consolidate power. They wielded propaganda to justify their actions. If these reactionaries were not suppressed, the nation would collapse. The mechanism exactly mirrored that of Henry VIII's own reign, only on a far larger scale. Instead of projecting psychological torture onto a single queen, modern dictatorships broadcast their show trials on radio, television, or newsreels, stoking hate, rallying the entire populace against a manufactured enemy. The historical lesson of Henry VIII is that unchecked power leads to a vicious cycle of impotence, deceit, violence, consolidation of power, and renewed impotence. Recognizing this pattern helps us remain vigilant for its recurrence in contemporary life, from national politics to corporate boardrooms. Whenever those in authority resort to repression firing staff, spreading slander, or publicly discrediting critics to cover up their failures, it is a warning sign of a pathologically insecure power seeking to protect itself rather than address the real problem. Not only did authoritarian regimes adopt Henry VIII's blueprint for control, but the spectre of his toxic masculinity continues to haunt personal relationships in the modern world. In intimate bonds, as in royal courts, those desperate to cling to power resort to deception, psychological dominance, and the stripping away of their partner's autonomy when faced with personal crises. Imagine a husband gripped by his own insecurities, perhaps aging, perhaps sensing a loss of influence, who fabricates elaborate accusations of infidelity against his wife. He might present doctored messages or misrepresented conversations as evidence, leveraging divorce filings or even legal complaints to weaponize the very institutions meant to protect families. The emotional scars this inflicts run deep. Victims of such manipulations often suffer anxiety, depression, and a shattered sense of self, all engineered to mask their partner's own feelings of inadequacy. This pattern extends beyond private residences and into the corporate sphere. In boardrooms across the globe, dramatic layoffs are staged like tragic pageants. A project falters whether from unrealistic deadlines or mismanagement, and rather than acknowledging failure, executives choose a scapegoat. Employees are publicly blamed for poor performance, their termination announced in sweeping emails or grandstanding meetings. Shareholders and staff alike witness a spectacle designed to reassure them that decisive action has been taken, even though the root cause may lie much higher up the chain of command. These corporate purges echo the Tudor king's nightly ordeals. Where once Henry VIII's retainers drained his festering wounds to conceal their horrid smell, Today's companies discard personnel to obscure their internal rot. The lessons from that royal bedchamber warn us not to appoint internal monarchs without checks and balances. Instead, a culture of collective oversight, transparent reporting, and protection of individual rights must prevail. Beyond the walls of home and office, the machinery of media amplifies these toxic tactics on a massive scale. Social platforms have become the new public square, where rumors spread like wildfire, reputations are shredded in real time, and cancel culture operates under a brutal logic. If you cannot win the debate, destroy the person's honor. An unverified allegation, once unleashed online, attracts retweets, screenshots, and shared outrage, transforming private failings into public condemnations. Targets of these campaigns endure relentless onslaughts of harassment, legal threats, doxing, and the ceaseless roar of collective condemnation. The mental toll is immense. Studies show that individuals subjected to online shaming often experience crippling anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and an elevated risk of self-harm. What began in a Tudor bedchamber as a king's paranoia about his own potency now spans continents in the form of digital mobs. In each of these contexts, relationships, corporations, media, the core mechanism remains the same. A figure with something to hide orchestrates a narrative of threat and betrayal, then marshals public or private power to silence dissent and project strength. The cycle unfolds predictably. Personal failure breeds fear, fear breeds deception, deception leads to aggression, and aggression is justified as necessary to maintain order. But, as history instructs, this is a self-perpetuating spiral. The more one seeks to conceal weakness through force, the deeper the insecurity becomes. Henry VIII's bedchamber rituals, testing his queens, staging sham trials, and smearing his own decay with perfumed oils, offer a chilling metaphor for the dangers of unchecked authority. They remind us that power, when wielded to mask vulnerability, corrodes both the wielder and those around them. A healthy partnership demands trust, openness, and a willingness to confront personal shortcomings together, rather than lashing out in fear. In business, effective leadership thrives on transparency, shared governance, and accountability, not on scapegoating and public shaming. And in our digital lives, we must resist the urge to partake in online inquisitions, instead fostering spaces for dialogue, context, and empathy. To break free from this toxic inheritance, we can adopt several practices. In personal relationships, partners can establish honest communication rituals, regular check-ins where feelings of inadequacy or fear can be voiced without judgment. They can agree on respectful conflict resolution strategies that avoid blame and focus on solutions. In organizations, leaders can implement clear performance metrics that apply to all levels, accompanied by open forums for feedback, ensuring that no individual becomes a lightning rod for systemic problems. In media and online communities, platforms and users alike can champion fact-checking, demand accountable storytelling, and promote restorative justice approaches when transgressions occur, rather than rushing to public crucifixion. Ultimately, Henry VIII's bedchamber may lie centuries behind us, but its shadows stretch into every sphere of modern life. The toxic patterns born of his desperation have mutated into relational abuse, corporate scapegoating, and digital cancel culture. By recognizing these echoes, we can confront our own internal king, the part of us that fears exposure and choose compassion over coercion, transparency over spectacle, and healing over humiliation. Only then can we transform the whispering corridors of power into open spaces of mutual respect, where true strength is measured not by dominion or fear, but by empathy and integrity. Although Henry VIII entered history under the exalted title Father of the Church of England, and is often celebrated as a pioneering reformer, the real impetus behind his break with Rome was deeply personal. He did not merely seek an annulment for political advantage or doctrinal purity. He was driven by the desperate need to conceal his own reproductive failure. His craving was not only for a male heir, but also for the preservation of his masculine honor before both his subjects and the very institution of the church. Once his body ceased to function as expected, he sought an external scapegoat. In the year 1533, the Act of Supremacy formally installed the king as supreme head of the Church of England, entirely severing papal authority. On its face, this measure was lauded as a sweeping reformation of faith. But for Henry, it was a spectacular escape hatch, a means to disguise the shame he could never openly acknowledge. The long-term consequences of that royal bedroom crisis went far beyond doctrinal realignment. Monastic lands and properties, previously dedicated to prayer, hospitals and education, were confiscated wholesale. Religious orders were dissolved, and their holdings were parcelled out to courtiers whose loyalty had been rigorously vetted. What began as economic expediency became, in truth, a cover-up for a king's private humiliation. Every religious statute, from the Act of Supremacy to the subsequent Act of Uniformity, bore the imprint of personal disgrace. The redistribution of wealth under the guise of reform masked Henry's deepest anxiety that his potency had failed him. This seismic shift forged a national church structure so tightly bound to the crown that dissent was equated with treason. A newly established apparatus of religious oversight monitored every parish, every sermon, and every act of worship. Failure to attend the mandated services of the Church of England could result in fines, imprisonment, or even execution. Suddenly, the private realm of faith became a public spectacle, policed by royal decree. What had been a spontaneous expression of devotion was now choreographed, with the state as choreographer and every citizen as a dutiful actor. The abrupt turnabout, hailed by historians as a courageous move toward national sovereignty, was, in reality, a spectacular act of self-exculpation. Henry, racked by pain and weakened by disease, refused to allow his physical decline to sully his legacy. Instead, he recast himself as both spiritual leader and secular monarch, wielding absolute authority to compel his people into compliance. The Church of England served not only as an instrument of worship but also as a mechanism of social control, binding the populace to the throne through fear of divine and earthly punishment alike. Over the following decades, this new ecclesiastical order entrenched itself deeply in England's political and social fabric. Bishops took seats in Parliament, elevating clerical voices to the same level as dukes and earls. Tithes flowed into royal coffers, financing wars and courtly extravagance. The nobility, rewarded with former monastic estates, became ever more dependent on royal favour, their prosperity tied to the king's whims. Thus, from the ruins of medieval monasticism rose a church that bore the king's insignia, its creed indistinguishable from royal policy. Yet the flames of religious strife, kindled by Henry's bedchamber turmoil, did not remain confined within his kingdom's borders. Across the Channel, the Protestant Reformation spread like wildfire, drawing lines between rival faiths and igniting intermittent wars that would scorch Europe for generations. In France, the Huguenots clashed with Catholic loyalists in a series of brutal civil wars. In the Holy Roman Empire, princes converted or reconverted for political gain, their territories torn apart by faith-fueled conflicts. Spain, under the Inquisition's grim auspices, hunted down suspected heretics with merciless zeal. All of these convulsions shared a common precipitant: the willingness of rulers to weaponize religious reform in defense of their personal agendas. And yet, despite the bloodshed and cultural upheaval, subsequent generations have often celebrated the English Reformation as a beacon of religious liberty. The memory of Henry's intimate struggles became obscured by narratives of parliamentary sovereignty and individual conscience. The Church of England evolved, tempering its initial severity and eventually embracing a more inclusive stance. Yet the historical paradox remains unsettling. What began as a desperate bid to mask impotence gave birth to a national church that could scarcely be distinguished from the crown itself, a potent reminder that personal motives can catalyze permanent institutional change. In the stillness that follows these tumultuous events, one can almost hear the faint echo of Henry's private shame, reverberating through the vaulted cathedrals he once repurposed. The very stones of Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's Cathedral, refitted under his command, stand as silent witnesses to the fusion of personal disgrace and political ambition. Every chanted prayer, every ornate procession, once served to bolster the spiritual authority of a suffering man who dared not admit his greatest weakness. As the night grows deeper, and our eyelids grow heavy with the weight of history, we might reflect on this profound lesson, that the private vulnerabilities of a single soul can reshape the destinies of nations. Henry VIII's physiological failure was eclipsed only by his determination to rewrite the script of religious authority, setting in motion a chain of events whose consequences are still felt centuries later. In the hush of dawn, when we rouse ourselves from slumber, let us remember that every reform, no matter how noble it seems, carries the imprint of its origin. And if that origin is a fear unveiled, then the fruits of reform may carry within them the seeds of future discord, unless tempered by humility, transparency, and respect for the very human frailties that bind us all. Each of Henry VIII's wives, from Catherine of Aragon to Catherine Parr, faced the same unforgiving rule. If she failed to bear a son, she was thrust into a vortex of accusations, divorce proceedings, or even execution. The relentless pressure to produce a male heir, combined with the rot at the heart of the dynasty, turned marriage into a spectacle of agony. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, endured decades of vain hope before being cast aside. Though she had given him a daughter, Mary, the king's obsession with a male successor overshadowed every other consideration. When Henry petitioned Rome for an annulment on the grounds that their union had never been valid, in direct contradiction to centuries of canonical precedent, Catherine found herself in the strange position of a married woman accused of living in sin. She watched helplessly as her status crumbled, her reputation besmirched by insinuations of sterility and disfavour. The woman who had once been celebrated as the embodiment of royal virtue was reshaped overnight into a cautionary tale. A queen who dared to challenge her king and lost everything in return. Anne Boleyn, Catherine's successor, faced an even more brutal fall. Elevated from lady-in-waiting to crowned queen through Henry's sheer will, she soon discovered the throne came with a hidden cost. As the years passed without a son, her favour waned. In the spring of 1536, she was dragged before a court convened at Westminster Hall, accused of adultery, incest, and high treason. In that grim chamber, Anne bore the unspeakable horror of watching her own brother condemned to death, the executioner's axe descending before her tearful gaze. Then, just days later, she too was led to the scaffold. The spectacle was as much about his wounded pride as it was about political expediency. By presenting his former queen as irredeemably guilty, Henry could claim moral high ground even as he concealed his own sexual failure. Catherine Howard, the king's fifth wife, was scarcely more fortunate. Barely 19 when she exchanged vows with a man more than 4 times her age, Catherine slipped into a gilded cage of fear and surveillance. Rumours of her past indiscretions, many likely fabricated, provided Henry's ministers with ammunition to bring charges of treason. Night after night, servants reported hearing her sobs echo down the corridors of Whitehall Palace. She was paraded before a tribunal that had already judged her, forced to hear lurid allegations meant to humiliate and degrade. Though no evidence of actual infidelity was ever proven, Catherine was condemned, beheaded, and cast into history as a cautionary footnote, a young woman's sacrifice to preserve the king's image of potency. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final queen, survived the ordeal physically, but not unscathed in spirit. As a widow of 2 previous husbands, she had been lauded for her piety and intelligence when she married Henry in 1546. Yet she walked a tightrope of royal favour, aware that a single misstep, an ill-timed joke, an unwelcome theological hint could prove fatal. Though Parr ultimately outlived Henry, her tenure as queen left her marked by a deep, persistent anxiety. Chronicles record her hesitancy to appear before him unaccompanied, and letters reveal her constant apprehension of falling from grace. The bedchamber that should have been her sanctuary became instead a place of constant dread. The psychological toll exacted by these marital trials extended far beyond the tragic fates of those executed. The surviving queens carried scars that ran deep into the recesses of memory. They were stripped of their status, their wealth, and their security. Even after regaining some measure of dignity, they remained haunted by the ordeal. Their names, once spoken with reverence, were now whispered in court corridors as symbols of failure and disgrace. Diaries and letters they penned in the aftermath serve as invaluable historical records, exposing the raw, brittle nerves beneath the veneer of royalty. In private correspondence, Catherine of Aragon lamented her sense of betrayal by the faith she had served, while Catherine Parr confided her sleepless nights and fears of sudden denunciation. These testimonies offer a window into the long-term effects of such trauma. The women described dreams of endless halls where judges in robes pointed accusing fingers, echoing the public trials that had sealed their fates. They wrote of moments when they would catch a reflection of themselves in polished armor or a gilt mirror and not recognize the person staring back, her eyes rimmed red with tears, her posture forever guarded against imagined threats. Even Mary Tudor, despite her later accession to the throne, never fully shook the stigma of being the daughter of a failed marriage. Her rule was shadowed by the memory of her mother's suffering, fueling her own harsh measures against Protestant dissenters. The narrative of Henry VIII's wives thus becomes more than a sequence of sensational court dramas. It is a study in the enduring impact of psychological violence. For each woman, the royal marriage that promised power and influence instead delivered humiliation and terror. The very institution meant to confer legitimacy marriage was weaponized into a mechanism of control. The threat of annulment, the pretense of legal proceedings, and the spectacle of execution were tools wielded with precision to enforce obedience. In reflecting on their experiences, we are reminded that trauma does not end at the fall of the gavel or the whisper of an annulment. It reverberates through the psyche, colouring every subsequent emotion and decision. The Queen's writings speak of an ever-present tension between duty and self-preservation, between the desire to maintain regal composure and the instinct to flee from that gilded cage. Their scars, invisible though they may be, shaped their lives long after Henry's reign ended, and in some cases, fueled their own acts of resilience and defiance. As the embers of this historical tragedy glow softly in our minds, we recognize a universal truth. When institutions and relationships prioritize power over personhood, the human cost is exorbitant. The marriages of Henry VIII's wives stand as stark reminders that the most intimate bonds can become arenas of dominance and despair. In the hushed spaces of our own lives, whether in romantic partnership or in professional alliances, these lessons echo still. Respect, empathy, and the acknowledgement of vulnerability are the only foundations strong enough to endure. Only by honouring the dignity of each individual can we prevent the private terrors that once stalked the English court from taking root in our own hearts and homes. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the figure of Henry VIII was cast in two wildly divergent lights. On one side, as a merciless royal exterminator, and on the other, as a visionary monarch of unparalleled political acumen. Early historians of the 19th century often glossed over or outright dismissed the more disturbing aspects of his health, choosing instead to spotlight his break with Rome, his sizable naval expansion, and his skillful manipulation of court politics. To them, Henry was first and foremost a towering statesman, the architect of English national sovereignty. Medical maladies were inconvenient footnotes, quickly swept aside to preserve a grand narrative of triumphant kingliness. By contrast, a wave of revisionist scholarship in the 20th century began to probe Henry's personal torments with renewed intensity. Modern historians, consulting neglected letters and rediscovered Tudor medical treatises, delved into the king's ulcerated legs, racking pains, and the ostensible bone infection, osteomyelitis, that plagued him for decades. Their accounts depict a ruler whose infamous fits of rage may have been less capricious displays of royal temper and more outbursts of agony, a body rebelling against itself. This school of thought argues that Henry's physical decay and the attendant psychological distress were inseparable from his draconian policies, his murderous purges of wives, his draconian suppression of dissent, and his relentless quest for religious uniformity. Inevitably, a scholarly debate erupted over the reliability of the sources. Some traditionalists maintain that descriptions of Gordon-scale ulcers and excruciating nighttime agonies were hyperbolic exaggerations, penned by factional opponents eager to sully Henry's reputation. They point to the richly embellished chronicles of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, when Tudor politics still simmered in memory. In those accounts, a chronicler might amplify the king's sores into gaping chasms of rot, all to underscore a moral judgment of his perceived cruelty and spiritual corruption. By portraying his body as a corpse animated by malice, the writer could more convincingly argue that his soul was equally rotten. On the other side, proponents of a medicalized Henry cite the meticulous notes of court physicians, whose surviving records detail nightly poultices, heated irons applied to leg wounds, and experimental treatments that ranged from draining pus to injecting herbal concoctions. These documents, transcribed in Latin and early modern English, describe symptoms consistent with chronic osteomyelitis, swelling, intermittent fevers, and persistent fetid discharge. More recently, interdisciplinary studies combining paleopathology and forensic analysis have examined skeletal remains attributed to the Tudor dynasty, searching for lesions characteristic of bone infection. While access to Henry's tomb has been restricted, these fragmentary findings lend credence to the notion that his physical suffering was both genuine and severe. Yet even among medical researchers, consensus remains elusive. Some experts caution that certain bone lesions, especially in remains exhumed centuries after burial, could equally indicate other conditions: tuberculosis of the bone, gout, or even syphilis, all of which were rampant in early modern Europe. Preservation conditions, tomb relocations, and contamination further complicate the picture. Consequently, a handful of clinicians urge historians to treat any posthumous diagnosis with humility, acknowledging that without direct access to the body and unambiguous clinical evidence, certainty may forever be out of reach. Beyond the debate over literal ulceration, the broader challenge lies in disentangling Henry's lived reality from the ever-morphing myths that have accreted around him. As Tudor chronicles fell prey to partisan editing, and as later novelists and filmmakers seized upon his larger-than-life persona, the boundary between fact and legend grew increasingly hazy. Historical romances and blockbuster period dramas have often cast him as either a gluttonous monster or a charming rogue, rarely pausing to explore the twilight zone of a man caught between sovereign duties and mortal frailty. The gap between the man who signed royal decrees and the man who writhed in nightly torment widened with each retelling. For the modern reader, or viewer, this duality presents both a peril and an opportunity. The peril lies in accepting either extreme without scrutiny, dismissing him as mere bloodthirsty tyrant, or canonizing him as a pioneering reformer. Such unbalanced portrayals risk oversimplifying the complex interplay of personal, political, and religious forces that shaped his reign. Yet the opportunity emerges when one embraces a nuanced perspective, acknowledging the brutal realities of his policies while recognizing the political imperatives and cultural contexts of the time. In the early 16th century, the bonds of faith and sovereignty were inseparable. To challenge the Pope was almost to challenge the social order itself. In that world, blood and religion were two threads of the same tapestry, each reinforcing the other. Thus, a balanced approach demands a synthesis of disciplines, combining the clinical insights of medical historians with the critical analysis of archival scholars and the interpretive frameworks of political historians and literary critics. Letters penned in haste, official proclamations issued under duress, private prayer books annotated in the margins, all these fragments must be woven together, each lending its own shade of meaning to the portrait of a king who was at once brilliant and broken. In the soft, drowsy hush that follows such contemplation, one glimpses the ultimate lesson of Henry VIII's historiography, that the line between human greatness and human frailty is perilously thin. To understand a figure so pivotal, one must inhabit both the throne room and the sickbed. Only by acknowledging the convulsions of his flesh alongside the convulsions of his realm can we begin to fathom the true dimensions of his power and his pain. In that intertwining of blood, bone, and faith, Henry VIII's story becomes not merely a chronicle of a monarch, but a testament to the tangled web of ambition, insecurity, and reform that defines the human condition. And so, as the echoes of history's longest night begin to soften into the hush of our own quiet moments, let us draw a gentle breath and cradle these reflections close to our hearts. The tale of a king who ruled with thunder and trembled in secret, who reshaped nations from the bedchamber's shadow, now drifts away like a candle's last flicker under the weight of sleep's tender embrace. Imagine the stone corridors and velvet drapes melting into twilight's mist, and feel the burden of royal ambition dissolving into the calm cadence of your own heartbeat. We have walked together through the corridors of power and pain, traced the contours of human frailty beneath crowns and sceptres, and witnessed how unchecked authority can twist the most intimate of bonds. Yet beyond the spectacle of thrones and trials, there emerges a quieter lesson, that every soul, no matter how exalted, carries its own vulnerability, and that true strength is born not in the roar of conquest, but in the stillness of compassion. In acknowledging the wounds of the past, we give ourselves permission to heal, to extend kindness where fear once ruled, and to choose understanding over dominance. Let your senses settle into the soft comforts that surround you now. The gentle weight of a blanket, the muted glow of a distant lamp, the soothing rhythm of your breath as it carries you closer to rest. Picture a vast, starless sky, stretching endlessly above a silent sea, and imagine your worries drifting away on slow silver currents. The ghosts of Tudor chambers fade into the vast expanse of night's embrace, leaving only the quiet promise of dawn's gentle light. And in this moment of stillness, remember the values that transcend eras and empires: empathy that bridges differences, honesty that dispels the shadows of deceit, and the courage to admit our own imperfections. These are the quiet revolutions that reshape hearts far more profoundly than any royal decree. As you close your eyes, let the memory of these truths wash over you like a warm breeze on a tranquil shore, carrying away the residue of unrest and illuminating the path to inner peace. Soon, the boundaries between storyteller and listener will blur, and the final images of Tudor courts will dissolve into the soft warmth of your dreams. Let the knowledge that every great reform must be tempered by humility and respect be your final companion as you drift across the threshold of sleep. Allow yourself to float free of any lingering weight, trusting that the lessons of history have found their resting place within you, safe from the turmoil of waking hours. And now, in this serene hush, I offer you a gentle invitation. If you have found solace or insight in our shared journey, please consider subscribing so that when we next gather beneath these virtual lamplights, we may explore new stories. Stories that awaken curiosity, foster understanding, and illuminate the quiet corners of the human spirit. May each video bring you both wonder and comfort, guiding you toward ever gentler truths. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be woven with the soft threads of compassion and clarity, carrying you into tomorrow's light with a heart unburdened and a mind at peace. Good night, whispered. Sleep well.